Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another exciting episode of the Security Repo Podcast. As always, I am your host, Dwayne, and joined by our wonderful, awesome co-host, Kazar. How you doing, Kazar?
Doing great. Hi, everyone.
Good to see you, man. This week, we have a really awesome guest, Josh Lee. He is a seasoned software developer with over a decade of experience, specializing in a broad range of topics, including operations, observability, and cloud-native databases. His passion for technology is matched by his enthusiasm for sharing knowledge through public speaking. And currently, Josh serves as a developer advocate at Altinity, where he creates educational content on Clickhouse and OpenTelemetry. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to see you. We've known each other for a few years through the conference circuit, and more recently, we just saw each other over at CodeMash. Fairly recent from the time this will go out. So, really awesome event in Northwest Ohio. It's good to see you there.
Definitely agree. Yeah, great times.
Josh, you come from the observability world, of course, working with Altinity today. So let's kick it off talking about observability. What is it, and why is it important, and how do you compare this area to our world of security?
Sure. So, what is observability? I think everybody has their own specific answer to that, right? There are a lot of vendors pitching very specific answers to that. Observability is sort of one of those terms that was coined by engineers, but has really been adopted wholesale by marketers. So I think we've seen definitions like the three pillars, which is based on metrics, traces, and logs, and an appealing definition because those signal types, right? Those are the tools that we've had traditionally for doing observability, and those are the tools that are available from vendors and through things like OpenTelemetry. But really, to me, like when we talk about observability versus monitoring, it's really just a mindset shift. It's not about the specific tools that you're using. You can use any of these tools for observability, and you can certainly achieve observability with the clever use of what I would call traditional monitoring tools. So it's really the mindset shift from we're going to anticipate what the problems will be and build in guardrails against those problems that we've anticipated is sort of the old way of thinking about it. And the new way of thinking about it is let's let the applications, let's let the infrastructure and the programs describe themselves, right? If they're emitting useful telemetry, then we can make sense of that in the increasingly complicated world of the software that we're trying to operate, right? So we need sort of self-describing software, and that's where the term observable comes from, right? From the mechanical engineering definition, meaning that you can understand a system's operation just by sort of looking at it from the outside.
So that reminds me of something you said once in a conversation we were having, Josh. That with observability, there's no lack of things to observe. You can observe everything like at a pretty deep level, and it's really boils down to what you care about, and like you need to limit in what you observe, and that feels like security to me. Like we can spend all day digging in as deep as we want to with security, but it's really like what are we really trying to protect? What's the security we really care about?
Yeah, absolutely. So in both cases, right, we're collecting a ton of data. And not all of it's useful, right? It's really not that useful to have 20,000 traces that I'll just say 200, okay, everything's good. And similarly, it's not that useful to have, a million events in your security system for just successful things as they're happening, right? But we do need to collect all of that data because we have to use it to establish our baselines. And then the real challenge, right, is in identifying what data is then interesting in both cases, whether it's security or observability. And for me, that's where context, right? Especially in the case of observability, that's where context becomes so important. So when I say context, right, the most basic primitive form of that would just be tagging all of your telemetry so that it can have some basic form of ownership and be routed in some way to the teams that care about it. But it can be much more evolved than just that, right? Context can mean that the software actually has a semantic understanding of how the moving parts are related to each other. And that can inform a much more powerful type of anomaly detection than just, say, like running, an algorithm on a time series or something like that.
Staying on the topic of observability versus security, if we can actually oppose these two things, I have always worked in security, and in my world, security observability really boils down to logs. right?
Hmm.
I want to get my server logs. I want to get my firewall logs. I want to get my workstation logs. And I want to get all of them into a central SIM like Splunk or IBM QRadar or what have you. And I want to run queries on it. But when I speak with my platform engineer coworkers, well, they're all talking about metrics all the time, about traces, as you mentioned earlier, and of course about logs. But logs are only a part of the story. So, do you have any insight as to why we in the security realm have been so stuck with logs for so long? What are we missing out on? Should we maybe think outside the box?
Uh, I'm not sure that you're actually missing anything, right? Like, I think it's just, it comes from a difference in perspective. If you coming from a background of managing infrastructure, right? Metrics are your bread and butter. Metrics are all you can get. A lot of, right? Like, if you want to know your CPU usage, that's always going to be a metric that's aggregated at the source. But when we're talking about the types of metrics that are relevant in a security or an observability context, I don't think that there's a lot of value and in today in pre-aggregating those at the source, because you're forcing yourself to anticipate too much, right? You're forcing people who aren't necessarily the ones who are going to be consuming the data to think about how it's being generated, versus letting developers describe what their application is doing with sort of arbitrarily wide events, and then the people who are responsible for managing the health of that system, which may or may not be the same people, can use that data to derive the metrics that are interesting to them, because metrics are useful as like an early warning sign, right? You want to know the trends that are happening in your system, but when they're pre-aggregated, they don't allow you to drill down into the raw data, the actual events that cause those metrics.
So I want to move into a little bit slightly different area than like what do we care about from the actual numbers, but who cares about these things? Does anybody straight up own observability in most organizations? I know like security, that's the CISO. I mean, for Git Guardians, Kazar. We
Mhm.
have a face and a name to put with it. But who owns observability in your org or in the org?
Sure. This is actually one of my favorite questions to ask, because there's so many different answers, right? So many organizations do this so differently. Generally, it's commonly going to be part of SRE, right? Either just wholly part of the SRE's responsibilities, or there will be an SRE sub team that is responsible for observability. Um, Now, just like with all things, in sort of the DevOps, right? DevOps divide and bridge. Um, I've seen organizations do it in what I would consider a healthy way, where the if you do have this central observability team, they're really providing tools and best practices and guidance. They're not acting as gatekeepers saying, "Oh, you have to check all of these boxes, otherwise your thing won't get deployed." Um, so it's definitely possible to do it in a more of an adversarial way, but I've seen a lot of examples of it being more healthy, and I would encourage people who are centralizing it to do that. I think um, in terms of who actually owns the observability, though, as I've been talking about, it has to be both sides, right? It has to be the people developing the software and the people operating the software coming together, because observability is where all of that context actually does come together.
All right, and let me throw you a bit of a curveball.
Sure.
What happens when one of these parties isn't accustomed, let's say, to the new way of doing things of observability? What happens if the developers, for example, have never seen a metric, right? Have never seen a Grafana dashboard or a Datadog dashboard? How can you maybe push that new philosophy onto them?
Uh, that's a great curveball. Um, I'm not sure that you need to. There needs to be a reason for them to do it, right? So, if they are not the ones receiving the alerts, if they're not feeling some of the pain of operating the software, it's going to be very, very hard to convince them to do things to relieve some of that pain, right? So they kind of have to be participating in the debugging process. They don't necessarily have to be on call, right? But like,
Hmm.
they have to be involved in that process, um, and that creates, I think, a little bit of motivation to do it right. I don't think you're necessarily going to get them to adopt wholesale tools that are totally unfamiliar, but that's why I think, right, like, getting back to your question about like logs versus metrics versus traces, Logs are great because of all of the signals, they're the one that is the easiest to iteratively improve. So you can start with, hey, you're just going to do the bare minimum so that we can like understand that your application is healthy. And then let's build it up from there and add more context. And maybe, right, in my opinion, tracing is really just logs with a little bit of extra, special structured metadata. So eventually you're getting to tracing, right? If you just start with logging and get better and better and better at it. And I think that's an easy way to bring app developers along because they're used to, that's how they debug is, printf, right?
Yeah.
Made it.
So can we definitively say that Josh is a fan of you build it, you run it?
Yes, definitely.
Sounds good.
Definitely the heart of DevOps right there. Like, yeah, it's your responsibility now. But that reminds me of something else from another conversation we had where the pushback itself isn't about like, this is a bad idea. It's about the actual implementation. This is something I think you talked about with OpenTelemetry is like, if someone walks in the room and says, this is what you're doing now, like that's where the pushback actually comes from.
Yeah. And especially, right, if it's coming from above, right, and you weren't involved in the process and this in the decision making process that got to that point, that's going to be really frustrating. I think that's where there are some interesting solutions to that, right? Like you can kind of work around a stubborn team as like an SRE or like observability team. You can work around a stubborn team with tools like eBPF. Auto instrumentation has some options depending on the language that you're working in, right? So there are things that you can do where the team doesn't necessarily have to even modify their application code to be brought in line in sort of this brave new OpenTelemetry world. I think a lot of the time it comes from showing the value, right? Showing a little bit of value that other teams are getting out of using these new tools. If you can do that, that can be really, really hard with distributed tracing and with security tools, right? Because in both cases, the value comes really when it's end to end. So how do you show incremental value along the way? And that's that can definitely be a challenge.
I was chatting the other day with a fellow engineer here in France, and we were talking about our respective security observability stacks. That's what we like to call them here in France. And he was saying that they had built their entire security monitoring on top of Clickhouse. And I was chatting about how we were working with Snowflake, putting all our logs in Snowflake, and how Clickhouse and Snowflake compare. So, what are your thoughts on that? Does it make sense really to like compare database management systems when it comes to security observability? Should we all go down the Postgres way, like all the apps, or do you have some other ideas on this topic?
Right, great question. So I've been talking a lot in our in the discussion so far. I've been talking a lot about arbitrarily wide events, and we've been talking about the volume events that we're dealing with for both security and observability use cases. At that volume, right, a traditional transactional database with all of the the guarantees and transactional guarantees that you get with something like Postgres or Maria, it can't keep up with the ingestion, right? These databases have gotten very advanced, and there are ways that you can kind of fine tune them, and in some cases keep up with the read requirements that are important in observability and security. Let me step back a bit, actually. So in both of these use cases, we have, from a data point of view, what's called a worm use case, right? So write once, read many. So you're writing a high volume of data, but you're writing it once, you're never updating it. But then you also need to read that data very, very frequently, right? In the case of observability, in both cases, right, it's often for alerting, right? If you have an alert for resolution of a second, 5 seconds across all of your alert rules, across all of your data, you're going to have to be querying that often, and that can add up across an entire organization. So we have this high ingest volume, we have a lot of reads, and that's really it, right? And then we just need a clean way to get rid of the data once it's at the end of our desired retention period. Clickhouse, as sort of an OLAP database, is really well built for that use case, right? Snowflake would be, I think, a comparable sort of architecture to ClickHouse, using an architecture that can adapt to this high ingestion and then very high speed reads over huge amounts of data, right? Billions and billions of rows. And so I think that's part of what's making it possible to do this, right? Before we had to pre-aggregate our metrics because we couldn't query over petabytes of raw events efficiently. But now we have tools that are enabling this.
I have to say, Josh, I really want to know, are you more of a ClickHouse fanboy or a Snowflake fanboy?
Well, I'm a bit biased since I work at Altinity, so I have to say ClickHouse. But I would also say that I work at Altinity because I'm a ClickHouse fanboy more than the other way around.
Man, I'm not sure we can get together any longer. I really like Snowflake. Of course, I'm kidding.
You're here representing yourself and your ideas, and that's why we're bringing in. But might as well answer the question right now. Like, what the heck is Altinity? Like, we've said the name, we've talked about ClickHouse, but what do you do over there?
Yes, absolutely. So we are ClickHouse experts. We offer hosting and support services for ClickHouse. So we have a managed cloud where it's sort of a complete white glove service. When we say that, we don't just mean write for your Sev1 incidents. We mean from designing your database schema to make sure that it's going to be operating as efficiently as possible, making sure that your app is interacting with it in the right way, making sure that you have backups and observability set up just the way that you want, right? So we really support you from design to day two and everything in between. And then we can actually take that managed cloud offering that we have, and we're offering it anywhere. So really anywhere you have Kubernetes or your own cloud account. We have some Terraform providers that make it really, really easy to just spin up an environment and connect it back to our support services in an environment that's fully controlled by our customers.
Okay, so imagine that I want to rebuild my security monitoring stack on top of Altinity's ClickHouse instead of my Snowflake. A big hurdle on the path would be rejigging the extract, transform, and load pipelines that I've got. Because today I'm taking these logs and I'm sending them to Snowflake, right? And I would have to do the same work, but instead sending them to ClickHouse. Do you make it easy for such use cases? Do you have any specific tools or maybe consulting services to maybe help in that sort of project?
Definitely. So that's absolutely something that we have helped many customers with, that sort of transition. And I'll also say that how much work you have to do really depends on what other tools you're using to do that ETL and how you're getting that data into Snowflake, right? If you're using Kafka, for example, there's a Kafka sync connector for ClickHouse. We're one of the contributors to that. It's fully open source. That's another benefit of ClickHouse, is that it's fully open source, and we run the fully open source version in our cloud. So there are ways that ClickHouse can sort of be slotted into an existing architecture. There are also tools that make it compatible with other APIs like the Elastic API, Prometheus, Tempo, things like that.
Do many of your customers have hybrid setups where they have both your ClickHouse-based solution and another one for maybe other purposes, or do they run both in parallel? Like, what type of situation do you often work with?
Yeah. So it's really, really common for customers to run a transactional database as well as an analytical database like ClickHouse. So you might have your Postgres database with all of your e-commerce transactions in it, and that might be duplicated entirely into your ClickHouse database so that you can run analytics on it alongside analytics coming in from whatever other transactional systems or analytics you're gathering across your organization.
That makes sense.
So I want to move us to something you talked about back at CodeMash, and it's something I've never heard anyone talk about quite the same way you did. And that was that DevOps is a foreign language. I think he subtitled that "There's no such thing as why there's no such thing as a junior SRE." Maybe you could just high level. What do you mean by that?
Sure. So the talk is inspired because what I studied in college, right? So years ago, I studied a field called second language acquisition, which really started with this idea that, like, hey, the way that we're teaching adults how to learn foreign languages is not actually working. It's not effective because we're just sort of drilling them with this rote memorization, and that's not enough. Um, and so this field developed that sort of, used combined neurology, psychology, linguistic anthropology, and sociology to understand how adults who know, right, like children have this amazing ability for learning languages, adults don't have it. So like, how do we compensate? And there were a number of lessons, right? And a lot of the lessons stem from sort of this idea that there's implicit and explicit knowledge, right? A language is not just the symbols, it's not just the syntax and the words. It's also a whole bag of cultural meaning and, cross-generational knowledge transfer is sort of all embedded into what it means to speak a language. And I would argue that DevOps is kind of the same way, right? We can say, okay, there's the stuff that's in the docs. There's this stuff that you can look up. There's the actual forms of the languages that you're using and the tools that you're using. But there's also just this whole baggage of cultural knowledge, right? A lot of us in the field right now sort of, started as teenagers. And there's sort of this cohort, right, that is not being replaced because no other generation has had that exact same experience, being the first to sort of grow up online, right? So how do we actually bridge that gap and teach that cultural part as well as the explicit part, right? The technical part.
Do you think that applies to security as well?
Absolutely. Right. I think that we probably don't even realize the extent to which we create these little bubbles, right? Even when I try to be aware of it, I get caught off guard and I'll say something to someone who is, in the tech industry, and I assume that they'll understand what I'm talking about, but they're from a different little sub bubble than I am. And so it's completely over their head, right? And so vice versa, right? Same thing happens to me all the time. So I think we're all in these bubbles, and even when we're aware of it, it's just like estimating, right? Like even being aware of it doesn't fix the problem. So I think just keeping that in mind when we're trying to teach other people and sort of having grace for each other, giving people enough confidence to sort of like, I'd like to say, like, be confidently wrong, right? That's really important when you're learning a foreign language, is to just try it and then have the opportunity to be corrected. But you also need to be corrected gently so that you're, not beating yourself up and not willing to try again. And you also need to be willing to ask for help when you have no idea where to start.
It's now DevOps, that totally makes sense because I can spin up a Docker instance on my machine and I can do whatever crazy thing I can dream up, and at worst I wasted my time. Security though has that overhead that if I get this wrong, even if it's just local, like
Mhm.
Kazar, can already see you smiling on that. It's yeah.
Yeah, I think you're missing something, Dwayne, is that you don't have to do security. Security is everywhere you already are, right? If you are just trying to test a new app um, at home on your own laptop with Docker, and you mess something up and accidentally expose that app on the wide internet, you've already messed your security, right? You don't have to be thinking, okay, now I'm doing security, how do I not mess this up? It's always there, it's always going to bite you in the back. So you have to constantly be on the lookout.
Is that part of that culture you're talking about, Josh? Like that
I was just going to say, right? So if you're not specifically a security person, that is part, right? That's part of the culture that we have to like teach people so that they don't go copy and paste some code from an LLM that was based on demo code, where like the demo code has a comment in it that's like, don't use this in production because there's no security here, right? And the LLM just faithfully copied it for you, and then the junior just faithfully copied it into production, right? So we need to inoculate people against that.
And I just fell for it myself. I'm just realizing there because I set security as a separate thing, and that's what. As soon as I saw you smile, Kazar, I was like, "Yeah, you know what? I think I'm falling into that fallacy." Like, but it's not a cultural thing. I grew up with, like, security. Sure, it's important, but it is a. There's what I'm doing, and then there's security. Not I need to do what I'm doing securely.
No, there isn't. No, there isn't. Like, think of it like plumbing, right? If you're working on your own house's plumbing, like, you can't do the plumbing and then think about the water not leaking out. No, the, the, the pipes need to not leak all the time, right? You can't just put the pipes in and I'll fix the leaks later. That doesn't work. And same thing with security, honestly.
As someone who stays
Well
in
said.
hotels a lot, I'm not sure that everyone's thinking that way with plumbing.
Yeah, well, I've been working on fixing up my new apartment for the last 6 months, so that explains things.
I see.
What is your favorite command line security tool?
Uh Traceroute, Nmap. Stick with
Traceroute I
the
can
stick.
get behind. Nmap, I'm afraid too many guests have already said Nmap, but let's talk.
Okay, then I'm sticking with Traceroute because you stick with the, right. Like you don't need a Swiss Army knife. Sometimes you just need, a really good chopstick.
That's fair. That's fair enough. All right. Okay, second question for you, Josh. What is your go to question in hiring interviews whenever you're interviewing someone?
Absolutely, great question. I really like to ask people about a time that they disagreed with someone and how they handled it. I think that's really important, right? Like even on this call, we've had some friendly debate, but I think when your organization's security or production application is on the line, things can get a little bit heated. And I think it's good to understand how people are going to handle truth finding in that situation.
So, last two questions we always ask all of our guests: best advice, worst advice about security. What's the best advice you're currently hearing out there in the world of security that you think, yes, that's what everybody needs to know?
So being, somewhat external to the world of security, maybe this is simple, but the best advice that I see is just to consider your attack vectors, right? Consider what the actual threats are that you're trying to protect against. Um, yes, the water needs to never leak, right? But like, are we at risk of someone running into our basement and setting off a grenade? Probably not, but maybe. It depends who you are, right? So you have to take that into consideration as part of your response.
Interesting. The first person I think brought up running into your basement with a grenade situation.
I don't know how I got there just from the pipes thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it makes sense. I think gophers is a more likely scenario, but yeah, I'm not worried about the guy with a grenade. I'm worried about gophers.
So that's right. So that is not an attack vector that I would have considered because I'm not a homeowner, but clearly I would have some rough lessons.
Tree roots and rodents. You'll be surprised when you buy a
Yeah.
house how much you have to deal with those.
Okay.
So worst advice. What's the worst advice you think you've ever heard about security?
Um. Oh, the worst advice. I mean, it's almost it's the flip side of that, right? It's I see this all the time in like home lab forums online, where people rail against you'll say something like, "Oh, I don't want to expose my DNS, my private DNS publicly," and someone will come in and say, security by obscurity is not security, and like they're right. You should definitely have multi-layered defense, but also it's a great idea to also not publish your DNS and invite people to come knock on the door. Like,
Are you saying that security through obscurity is good?
I'm saying it's part of a layered defense, right? You should definitely have defenses behind it, but it doesn't mean that you need to announce yourself to the world and say, "This is what I'm doing."
I
You
think
know,
that's a very elegant way of putting it, and I also say that security through obscurity is really the basis behind passwords, actually. Because if you just go around sharing your passwords with everyone, it's not gonna work well for you, will it? So, yeah, security through
yeah,
obscurity sometimes makes very good sense.
But MFA always.
yes.
Definitely.
We all get behind that one. All right, Josh. Thank you very much for coming on the show and laying down so much knowledge with us. Uh, if people want to follow your adventures out there, follow what you're putting out on the internet, where you're going to be speaking and all, where can they get a hold of you? Where can they follow your adventures?
Absolutely. So I'm Josh Lee on LinkedIn. Josh Lee Creates on at Hachyderm on Mastodon, and Josh Lee Creates at whatever the basic one is on Blue Sky. And you can also come join me in Slack at altinity.com/Slack, especially if you have questions about ClickHouse or any of that stuff that I was talking about. That's a great place to ask.
All right. Any final words before we get out of here, Kazar?
Yeah, Josh, it's been a pleasure chatting with you today, but you still haven't changed my mind about Snowflake. I'm afraid I am still a Snowflake fanboy.
Fair enough. We'll have to discuss that one over a beer sometime and
We
see
will.
if I
We
can
will.
get you there.
Great. And Josh, just any parting words, any last wisdom, anything you want people to remember from listening to this episode?
I guess just be excellent, right? Like, yeah.
You can't do better than that. So we'll end it there. Make sure you like, subscribe, send this to your friends, send it to your enemies if you didn't like it. And thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.